you're my hope and stay. Teach my song to rise to you when temptation comes my way.
All right, just so everybody knows, if you need to get up and go get a snack, Miss Laurie, if you know her, she's amazing. She put out snacks for everybody, made coffee. She wanted me to let you know that both pots are leaded. So if you want to sleep tonight, take that into consideration. If you're new to Rio, by the way, men's bathroom in the back corner of the fellowship hall that way, women's bathroom in the back corner of the fellowship hall that way, in the back. See if I can fake you out. All right, Mark, are we live? Yes, sir. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. Thanks so much. This is Truth Unearthed, and it's all about archaeology in the Bible. And so just as a genesis to jump in to this, I first got interested in archaeology going back to 2010. I took a trip with Dr. Gage and Pastor Tom, and we went over to Israel. Some of you were on that trip. This back in 2010. We went all through Israel, and then we spent 2 days in Egypt. We got to go to the Cairo Museum. And I noticed if you come to session 4, you'll see how much biblical evidence we find in Egypt. But there were so many cool things that started popping out in the Cairo Museum and different ways that the Egyptians did things. So I'm like, man, that looks a lot like what you find in the scriptures. And so when I went home, I had this evidence, and I saw a special on Netflix called Patterns of Evidence. Anybody in here seen that? And there were archaeologists and some of the top scholars of their field that were talking about evidence for the slavery of the Hebrews and evidence for the exodus of the Hebrews. And I thought to myself, they named one of the archaeologists. And when they named one of the archaeologists, I went online and I started finding this guy's archaeological reports. And like every normal person, I started reading all of them. Right? Tested my marriage, But I was so fascinated because as I'm going through the archaeologist, that particular archaeologist report, I'm like, they missed that. They missed that. Oh my goodness, this is all echoing the biblical story. And so I started paying attention to archaeological headlines, which once a month I go and I do Google searches and I mine for all the latest updates. And here's something that's really encouraging for us Christians. There is now an amazing amount of evidence that's been emerging in the last few decades that support Christianity. So you go on, like I did this just a little bit ago, you go on and you Google archaeology, Bible, or whatever your code words are going to be, search words are going to be, and you'll find an archaeological dig reignites the debate over Old Testament's historical accuracy, and they find all these things underneath Jerusalem that validates the kingdom of Solomon. Or a 31-year-old inscription that they just found recently that's linked to a biblical judge. So how many of you have heard of the judge named Gideon that lived 3,100 years ago? They found his name on pottery in the region where he comes from. And you find all of these kinds of stories all over the news. This is Christianity Today in November, how archaeologists are finding signatures of biblical kings and ancient villains and maybe a prophet. On all of this pottery, we're finding out that people like Jeremiah and Isaiah and Hezekiah, famous names of the Old Testament, they're for real. This isn't a book just of fables that are put together to give people some kind of false hope in something. Our Bible is reliable. And if the history of the Bible is reliable, then the promises of the Bible are reliable. The hope of salvation. And so what we're going to do in this course, there's going to be 9 sessions, and we're going to start at the very beginning, starting in Genesis, and we're going to go to Jesus. So we're going to start today, we're going to talk about creation up to the Tower of Babel, the first 11 chapters of Scripture is all we're going to do today. And then we're going to And it's going to be a lot to get through that. So brace yourselves, right? Like, prepare for the fire hose. I apologize in advance. Then February 9th, Genesis and the patriarchs and Sodom and Gomorrah and the life of Joseph and what you find in Egypt that verifies what the end of the book of Genesis teaches. Fascinating stuff. The Hebrew slavery, the Exodus, and walking through to where Moses leads them to the wilderness and Joshua leads them into the promised land and the judges reign. And then you have the kings and the decline of the kings. And there's just a massive amount of evidence for all this. The Babylonian exile, the days of Jesus in the last session we're going to do is something that you may have come across quite a lot. Are our scriptures reliable? And you'll notice that there are a couple of dates, like between February 23rd and March 9th, there's an Ash Wednesday that will take off. There's a gap between March 23rd and the 6th, and a gap between the 6th and the 20th. Otherwise, see you next week, right? We'll be right back here. And so, if you go through the timeline, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be walking through the timeline of the Old Testament and into the New Testament, just showing you that it's all true. It's pretty amazing what we can validate. And so here's the question, like, if this stuff is out there, if there is this evidence, why are we just now hearing about it? Why are they just now writing about it? And the answer to that is archaeology is not a very ancient field. If you went back before the 17 and 1800s, people just accepted the truth of the Bible a priori. It was like, yep, you told me that God created the heavens and the earth. I'm in. I believe. Jesus died for me. I'm in. I buy it. Then the Enlightenment came along in the 17 and 1800s, and this is what happened. Humanity started thinking awful highly of themselves, and they became curious. It was just a good thing. But a number of things came out of the Enlightenment where they started teaching schools of thought like skepticism. You can't believe anything you hear. Rationalism. You got to parse everything. Empiricism. I'm not going to believe it unless I can put my physical hands on it. Unless I can smell it with my nose and see it with my eyes, I refuse to believe it. And so what happened is now the church and the skeptical side are like, okay, well, I guess we better race to see what's true. And off they went into the field of archaeology, and that is when archaeology really began to take off. So out of the field of skepticism, you had this race that came. And archaeology is just two words that come from early or beginning. Arche, like we get the word archaic, and logos, which means a field of study or a rationale or a truth about something. And so it's the truth, it's the study of our beginnings. And so why is this just now starting? If you went back into the mid-1800s, you had the Ottoman Empire controlling all of the Promised Land, all of Egypt. The Ottomans were what religion? Muslim. Do you think they were excited about Christians coming in and digging around for evidence? So you didn't see it until the Ottoman Empire started to decline. And when the Ottoman Empire started to decline, you had Queen Victoria, who had a real interest in finding evidence in support of the Christian faith. And so she funded people like Charles Warren. If you've ever been to Jerusalem and you go under the city, you find things like Warren's Shaft, where you're looking at all kind of ancient Jerusalem. And he went there and dug around and found a lot of cool stuff. And so after that, you had the Palestine Exploration Fund, the American Palestine Exploration Fund. William Albright, who is the father of biblical archaeology, goes over there and he digs all over the place. He's digging in Jerusalem and he's digging in Jericho and he's digging in all these other ancient cities, and he's finding stuff that's really amazing. Lots of wind behind the sails of Christianity. The Dead Sea Scrolls are found. I mean, just lots of evidence validating them. And then all of a sudden in the mid-1950s, you had a woman by the name of Kathleen Kenyon, and she founded a school, a thought called minimalist. And it was like, don't read too much into the evidence. That evidence isn't necessarily supporting the biblical story. And so you had the maximalists going, of course it's about the Bible. We should use the Bible as our blueprint of where to dig because it's trustworthy. And the minimalists are over there going, it's all garbage. You know, don't trust it. You're overblowing it. You're making too much out of what you're finding. And so in the aftermath of that, for the next 30 years or so, biblical archaeology kind of slowed down theological liberals who said, it's myth, it's fable. You know, they wrote this. Actually, Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible. All of them aren't ancient. They were written during the Babylonian exile much later to give Israel a history, but it's all made up. That was the prevailing thought, even in seminaries during that time. And then here recently, we have this modern explosion where evidence is just piling up. Really, really cool, very, very fun evidence. And so tonight we're going to talk about 4 different categories. The miracle of creation, right? Global flood, the Tower of Babel, and the spread of languages. So all of these stories are considered prehistoric. They're the hardest to prove because they're the oldest. They sound the most like fables to so many people. So I want to start off by giving voice to one of the leading skeptics and kind of the father of skepticism, a guy named David Hume, who was an atheist. And this is the standard that he gave for skepticism. So listen to this quote. You kind of have to do some mental gymnastics to understand it. He says, "No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle." So anybody who comes to you and says there's miracles or that God created the universe or Jesus rose from the dead, no testimony, no matter what you read or hear people say, should be sufficient to establish that unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be even more miraculous than the fact to which it endeavors to establish. You follow? And so what he's saying is, it should have to be more miraculous for the creation story to not be true in order for us to believe it. Challenge accepted, right? Let's look at what you would have to believe to be an atheist, to believe that there is no sense of creation. That's going to be our first challenge tonight. So we start with what the Bible says about creation. There are 3 different elements of creation. You learn this in science. There's time, there's space, and there's matter, right? In the first verse of the Bible, you have God who comes forth and says, in the beginning, he's announcing time. Before this, what was before the beginning? There was no time. So all of a sudden, God, who's outside of time, who's outside of space, who's outside of matter, launches a beginning, and there's time, and he creates the heavens, the space in which the universe exists, not the place where his throne is, the heavens, space, and the earth. He begins to create matter, the very first verse. And there's a grid that every single person, no matter what faith you are, no matter what your beliefs are, every person has to answer these questions. And this was called the Kalam grid, the Kalam cosmological argument. And it says, okay, everybody comes to this universe and has to answer this question. Was there a beginning? And then what the Kalam cosmological argument says is, if there was a beginning, did it have a cause? And if it has a cause, what caused it? It's kind of like rational thinking, right? You can walk through that. But the first question is, did the universe have a beginning? Well, for hundreds of years, for people who did not believe in God, like, Aristotle, for instance, believed that matter was eternal. That it's just always been here. It didn't need a creator because it's always been here. And for a long time, that was a sanctuary and a safe harbor for atheists. Well, why do you need God? Matter's always been here. You ever get in the argument with an atheist and it's like, oh, you say this came from that, and this came from that, and this came from that. Well, where did this come from? And eventually they say, well, where did God come from? You know what you're both recognizing? Something had to be here first. Something had to be eternal. And so is the material universe eternal? And here lately, virtually all scientists have come to the agreement that the universe had a beginning. Matter is not eternal. And what's their argument? So Stephen Hawking, one of the most brilliant men who's ever lived, who does not believe in God, who is an atheist, he passed away, but he called this probably the most remarkable discovery of modern cosmology. Listen to what he said. All evidence seems to indicate that the universe has not existed forever, but it had a beginning. You know what was one of the most convincing arguments for him is if I say, okay, the universe is playing out, right? Pretend it's a movie and it's going forward. And I want to find out what happens. And we know, by the way, that the universe is expanding. It's doing this. So I want you to imagine, here's your movie, boom. All right, now let's stop it, put it in rewind, and what do you come to? A beginning, a single point of origin. And all the math of all the cosmologists say this is something that could not have possibly been a repetitious cycle that just kept doing this. The math won't allow it. So mathematically, it had a beginning. We can tell by rewinding the tape that there had to be a single point of origin. And beyond that, so he says the arrow of time will not reverse. The universe has not existed forever. I love that little cartoon, the entropy seminar, where all the results of a 5-year study into the second law of thermodynamics. If you know what the law of thermodynamics is, that's funny. What is the law of thermodynamics? The second law of thermodynamics says that everything is constantly losing energy. So hang with me. Why is this little podium that's made of whatever this is standing here? Because its molecular integrity has energy that's holding it up. And what's going to happen in 1,000,000 years to this thing? It's going to disintegrate. It's going to become dust. What's going to happen to me in 100 years? I'm going to be dust. What's going to happen to you, this building? What's going to happen to our star eventually, our sun? Everything is constantly losing its energy. So I want you to imagine this. Here's the state of energy, and it's in constant decline. Okay? So if you have an infinite universe that has existed forever, and it's in constant decline, what should you find by now? It should be totally flatlined. It should be at the bottom. I mean, if it's been dropping forever, infinitely, it should be infinitely low, with no order, no heat, no structure whatsoever. And so all of the scientists on this matter are in agreement. This is Stephen Hawking again. He says, the theory that the universe has existed forever is in serious difficulty with the second law of thermodynamics. The universe would be in a state of complete disorder by now, and everything would be at the same temperature, just cold, no heat. This kind of beginning to the universe, and hear this, this kind of beginning to the universe had to be imposed on the universe by some external agency. Welcome to the team. It had to be imposed by an external agency. We would call that God. But Stephen Hawking and a lot of the popular voices today decide that it's not the direct intervention of God. Rather, it's something that he calls imaginary time, which is the perfect name, actually. Imaginary time. Well, what is he saying? He's saying, and this is the popular argument, that the universe couldn't have come from the direct intervention of design or a spiritual being who brought all things into motion. Instead, they go to what's called the multiverse. How many of you have heard of the multiverse? That there's too much order, there's clearly a beginning, and so what had to happen is there's an infinite number of universes, or many, many universes, that exist outside of us. And in one of those universes, by chance, everything had all the right properties for life and everything else, and that universe, which we can't study or examine, hiccuped, burped or something, and all of a sudden, whoosh, our universe popped into being. And oh, if we could only study these other universes that gave birth to us. So listen to their argument. Something outside of our time, space, and matter created all of this. I mean, they're backing their way into the belief that there had to be a designer, a God who brought all this into motion outside of our own space, time, and matter. And yet they say it's just a random multiverse. That kind of length to avoid the existence of a God who made us. And so we see there's a beginning. Okay, well, what's the next step of the Kalam cosmological argument? If we see that there's a beginning, well, then the next question is it caused? Is our universe caused to come into being? Or is it uncaused? Is it totally accidental, just randomly blown up and here we are? Or is there design? Is there precision? Is there a mind behind our universe? And I just want to walk you through some math here. So brace yourselves if you hate math. This is fascinating to me. So Dr. Hawking marveled at the odds against the Earth's existence, referring to just one factor necessary for our existence. He wrote, so imagine at the beginning when everything started expanding. He said if the rate of that expansion, 1 second, so boom, and everything starts spreading. If the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller, even by 1 part in 100,000 million, or 10 to the 17th power, on that kind of a razor's edge, just this way or just that way, the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size. And so you think of the odds that are required just for that one factor. So you go to Google Maps. How many of you have ever been on Google Maps? And you zoom in on your neighborhood or whatever. Well, all maps and all images and all pictures that are online are made up of these tiny things called pixels. Google Maps right now consists of 1.5 terapixels, or 1 with a 5 and 11 zeros after that. So a huge number. That's how many pixels are in Google Maps. And so just for this one, so you can kind of wrap your head around how big of a number this is, you would have better odds of selecting one randomly chosen pixel on the entirety of planet Earth and then to be struck by lightning for this one factor that's essential for life to hold true. All right, so let's go back to David Hume. Is it more miraculous to believe that this happened by chance? Or is it more miraculous or less miraculous to believe that there's a designer? Is it less inconceivable? Now everybody's thinking of a movie, right? Inconceivable. It's clear. You have to have more faith to believe in the random chance. So we go to the next thing. All of these conditions, this is just a small sampling for life to exist on Earth. And these are conditions that people who are not believers, who are not Christians entirely, come up with. It has to be in this perfect expansion rate of the universe we just talked about. It has to be in the habitable zone of our galaxy, right in between these arms of the Milky Way where there's less stuff to destroy us, non-eccentric neighboring orbits so the planets aren't wrecking into us. The star type that has consistent energy to heat our planet so that we don't fall into cooling or we're not scorched up. The size and distance of the sun, you get the idea. There's so many of these things. The tilt of the Earth is precise. The moon's gravitational pull is precise. There's so much that's on a razor's edge that if it just went a little bit off, all life on Earth is gone. There's no possibility for life to emerge. And so Donald Page, who's a professor at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, these are not people on my team, right? Has estimated that the Earth's likelihood of randomly emerging with all those perfect conditions to sustain life would be 1 out of 10 to the 124th power. That is a 1 with 124 zeros behind it. Buy that lottery ticket. How absolutely inconceivable are those odds? Well, let's think about it this way. That's the number. If you look this up on Google, you'll find that scholars estimate that there are 10 to the 80th power number of atoms in the entire universe. Atoms, okay? 10 to the 80th power. That's 10 to the 124th is the odds. And so get this, you would have far better odds of correctly selecting one pre-chosen atom from all the atoms in the known universe and the 100 billion galaxies that we have and all the stars and planets and moons and everything else where there's an inconceivable number of atoms. You get to pick one. And that has to be correctly. And then you have to select 3 randomly chosen pixels on Google Earth in 3 consecutive attempts. Who in here wants to go for that? I'll bet you some stuff. Yeah. Like these odds are absurd, but we're not then done. So that's just to have the conditions for life, and then life randomly emerges. Various scientists have placed the probability of a living cell randomly emerging from all the cocktail of things in creation, even when provided all the necessary building blocks for life, at between the low end is 1 over 10 to the 40th power. The high end is 1 over 10 to the 390th power. It's not going to happen, in other words. It's virtually impossible. And so then, that's not all, because it'd be great if life emerged, but if it doesn't reproduce, who cares? It dies, it's gone. And so, conditions necessary for life, life has to randomly emerge, then it has to have the ability of self-copying. And so Dr. Richard Dawkins, very famous evangelistic atheist, writes, he says this: nobody knows how it happened, but somehow, without violating the laws of physics and chemistry, a molecule arose that just happened to have the property of self-copying, a replicator. This may seem like a big stroke of luck. Well, yes, it does. He says, freakish or not, this kind of luck does happen. And then he says, and we're evidence because we're here. Kind of backwards logic, right? So the sort of lucky event that we're looking at could be so wildly improbable that the chances of it happening are somewhere in the universe could be as low as 1 in a billion, billion, billion in any 1 year. So 1 over 10 to the 27th power. So let's start adding these odds together. So Donald Page, 1 over 10 to the 124th, the most conservative estimate, right? The most generous estimate we can give of life randomly emerging is 1 over 10 to the 40th power. Dawkins' own estimate for life self-replicating is 1 over 10 to the 27th power. So we're generously at 1 over 10 to the 191st power. So let's, how do you even make sense of that? Ready? You'd have better odds of selecting 2 randomly chosen atoms throughout the 100 billion galaxies of our universe, given only 2 selections to do so, and then also winning Powerball in 3 consecutive attempts. So like, it really does. Like, it takes more. Now, that doesn't get us to Christianity. But it takes way more evidence. It takes way more faith to believe that we came about with no design, that we just emerged, and all of these things are just so perfect and precise for us. It takes way more evidence or way more faith to believe that. And so Dr. Michio Kaku is a professor of theoretical physics at City College in New York. He has been called one of the smartest people alive, right? He's not a believer. He's the guy who was the pioneer of string theory, if you know what that is. And he concluded, listen to what he says, we are in a world made by rules, created by an intelligence. Believe me, everything that we call chance today, because that's been the argument for decades, centuries, everything we call chance today, what does he say? Won't make sense anymore. To me, it's clear that we exist in a plan which is governed by rules, that we were created, shaped by a universal intelligence and not by chance. He doesn't land at God, but he knows there has to be a higher being, some sense of energy, and he tends toward pantheism. I love this guy's quote, so I included it in here. This is Sir Fred Hoyle, who's very famous among astronomers and astrophysicists. He says, a common sense interpretation of just the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, made it perfect, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. There's no chance. It's impossible that we exist today by random forces. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion beyond question. John O'Keefe, NASA astronomer, I love this quote, we are, by literally astronomical standards, a pampered, cosseted, cherished group of creatures. If the universe had not been made with the most exacting precision, we could never have come into existence. It's my view that these circumstances indicate that the universe was created for man to live in. So you go back to the Kalam cosmological argument, and you say, okay, we had a beginning. It'd be hard to argue against that. There's design which suggests that this is caused. It would be hard to argue against that. And so where you're reasoned into is this a personal God? Or is it an impersonal God? Or the stories of the Scripture of God having a covenant with His people and walking through all of these stories with His people, can we rely on them? And that's what the rest of this course is going to be about. Are those stories of God working with His people true? And obviously, the farther back you go in history, the harder it is to answer those questions. But we'll start here. Is there any evidence that supports the accounts in the opening verses, opening chapters of Genesis? And the answer to that is, yes, if you go back and you look, there are so many ancient stories. Like we can't go back and excavate, the garden and find the apple and all that stuff. Like that's lost. They didn't build skyscrapers in the Garden of Eden that have endured. But you find all these echoes that come through history. And I want you to ask yourself this question, because I can't give you archaeological evidence of Adam and Eve. But I want you to ask, where do these echoes come from? Because one of the things that archaeologists have found are all these legends that surround that region where Eden would have been. And one of the things that you find again and again and again and again in these ancient cultures are serpents that emerge as the adversary of both God and man. And so many ancient civilizations also feature stories in which gods or men are forced to contend with a serpent. In Egypt, the sun god Ra faced Apophis. In Canaanite mythology, Baal and Anat battled the seven-headed Lotan, the serpent dragon. Mesopotamian myths include the Enuma Elish, the Etana myth, the Inanna and Haluputri myth. The famous story of the Epic of Gilgamesh is where Gilgamesh is on a way. He's trying to find where he can find everlasting immortal life. And he hears about a plant that offers everlasting life. Sound familiar? Tree of life, Genesis 3, Genesis 2. And he goes on a journey and he finds this tree. And when he finally finds this tree of life, the serpent comes along while he's sleeping and steals it from him and imposes mortality on him. There's this legendary, this imprint in human memory that remembers some kind of a battle, some legend of man and God going up against serpents. In Egypt, China makes much of the dragon. In Egypt, you have the serpent-headed crowned king. That doesn't come out of nowhere. You can find ancient, this is just fascinating, this is called the temptation seal. It's in the British Museum today. It dates back to 2200 BC. And what do you see in this? You see a man and you see a woman that are sitting at a tree with fruit, and they're both reaching out their hands. And what do you notice behind her? What is that? I mean, when people find it, they think, okay, well, this is recording some kind of myth, some kind of memory that they had in Sumer, one of the most ancient civilizations on planet Earth. And they come up with things like that. And the realm of genetics, this is kind of interesting. And there's a lot more to be done here, but Scientific American publishes an article that says humans are all more closely related than we commonly think. And so they track down mitochondrial DNA, which is the line of women, and they track down Y chromosomal genetics of the man. And what they're finding is the most recent common ancestor of the women, and this doesn't match up. There's a lot more to understand. I'm not even saying that this is Adam or Eve, right? But the most common ancestor and so-called genetic isopoint illustrate the surprising connections of many of our family trees. And what do? And the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, get this. Researchers reported their findings after examining mitochondrial DNA from all the various races of mankind. And in their research, it was revealed that genetic compositions of various races require what? A recent single origin for modern humans. It's not scattered. A recent single origin for modern humans. And do you know what they called the one woman where it all comes together with mitochondrial DNA? They call her, these are not Christians, mitochondrial Eve. Isn't that cool? Trace back further with other studies and you find Adam. This is one of the, that's going to go twice. I knew it. So this was in the magazine Nature. This is a quote lifted out. These analyses suggest that the genealogies of all living humans overlap in remarkable ways in the recent past. In particular, the most recent common ancestor of all present-day humans lived just a few thousand years ago in these models. Not the first human, but one that we can all say, oh, that's Aunt Rose. We're all related to Aunt Rose, and it may go back before her and likely does. But what does that mean? That's a recent common ancestor. That sounds very familiar. It's not humanity evolving and emerging on different continents and random, like we come from the same stock. So is there any evidence that supports the biblical account of Noah and a worldwide flood? Well, in Genesis, one of the questions that I get all the time is, why did people live so long? Before the flood, you have people living so long, and I don't know the answer to that. So I've heard really interesting answers that whatever cataclysmic event caused the flood to go up, it changed the atmosphere, it reduced people's immune systems, maybe it shortened their lifespans. Credible arguments can be made. We'll get into some of those. But this is something that they also found in Sumer, which is one of the most ancient civilizations. And I don't believe the record, but I want you to hear what this generational memory is. Listen to this. So this is what's called the Sumerian Kings List. And they're writing on there, this goes back to before Abraham's time, and they write 8 kings reigned there 241,200 years. Say what? Does anybody in here believe that? Like, I don't believe that. But it said, then the flood swept thereover. After the flood had swept thereover, when the kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. So what are the Sumerians saying? They're saying that the kingship got lowered, and after this, things radically changed. They weren't so divine, but prior to this flood, what flood? What flood are they talking about? I'm curious to know that. That prior to this flood, people lived an outrageously long time. Take it that way. In the records, before Moses ever penned the book of Genesis, the world had knowledge of some flood, and on the other side of it, people lived an outrageously long period of time. That makes Methuselah living 969 years look like he was died in infancy, right? By comparison. So there's some collective memory of that, which is interesting. You go to one of the oldest cities in the world. This is where Abraham was born, in the city of Ur. When they ran over, remember when Queen Victoria sent people over into that region to start doing excavations, one of the first places they went was to the ancient city of Ur. And this guy, Sir Charles Leonard Woolley, excavated Ur. And as he's digging down, so in archaeology, here's a city and it gets covered over and it gets covered over and it gets covered over and conquered and burned until you get to the modern day city. And so what archaeologists do is they dig down into the city. Well, you get civilization, 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 11 feet of silt. Civilization. Why is 11 feet of silt on top of a city? What is silt? It's what you find from floods. It's what you find in deltas at the mouths of rivers and all that. It's water-swept stuff. And so you look at what he writes. And so later on in 1934, you go to another sister city of Ur, Kish. All these are biblical cities that are named in Genesis 10 and 11. And Assyriologist, a guy who studies ancient Assyria, Stephen Langdon, and French archaeologist Charles Louis Wadelin conducted excavations in the ancient city of Kish, and they recorded what's a deluge stratum. What does deluge mean? Flood. So here they go down, and there's different stratums of different periods of the city's existence. They get to what they call a deluge stratum between prehistoric ruins of the city and more recent layers of the city. And in their report, they noticed that the stratum contains river sand mixed with shells and fish that are covering a city, adding that there was evidence that the city was submerged by a great flood about 3000 BC. Okay, that's really fascinating. So here you can see their initial report, the deluge stratum, and here they're digging around, and you can see where they mark how the deluge stratum is, just covered with silt. So then there's another city, Shuruppak, and all of these cities are some of the most ancient cities in the world. How many of you have ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh? Just mentioned it a little bit ago. It's another story that's ancient that tells of a massive worldwide flood, or a flood of that region for sure. And one person survives the flood, and he lived in their tale in that city. And so after the excavations of Ur and Kish, archaeologists found a flood stratum, another one, in the city of Shuruppak. And this site was home to the mythical, so the guy who's in the Epic of Gilgamesh who survives the flood, Utnapishtim. Try that. I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but it sounded right, didn't it? The survivor of the great flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the flood was sent by the gods to destroy humanity. But this guy found favor with the god Ea, who is their god of wisdom, and he was given everlasting life. So Gilgamesh goes to this guy, and he's like, how did you get everlasting life? He's like, oh, there's a plant over there. You got to go get it. That's the plant that Gilgamesh chases after, that the serpent robs from him to cause him to die. And all of that, 2950 BC. So right about that time, there's this really, really, really fascinating event that happens that radically changes a lot of the world. And they've just now finding us, it's called the Burkle Crater, and you see it down there with the little pin that you see in the map down in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Madagascar. Well, what the Burkle Crater is, and they've just discovered this, is if you went down 2 miles underneath the surface of the ocean, there is an 18-mile wide crater. What causes a crater? Comet, meteor, so there's this massive collision that makes it through 2 miles of water to create an 18-mile crater on the ocean floor, which yielded 600-foot tall super tsunamis in they date it to 2800 BC. Can you imagine a 600-foot tall, 60-story building tsunami coming to the coastline? That would not be fun. Scientists note that the super tsunami resulted in an eclipse because you have this superheated comet coming through the Earth's atmosphere, blazing hot, hits the water, sends up this massive steam cloud with all this moisture and everything else. It blots out the sun over the whole planet. Catastrophic flooding, torrential storms, deep sedentary chevrons on land. You go to the coast of Madagascar. You know how if you have water rushing through something, it creates those chevrons, the little V's where water runs past? These are 600 foot high. The water that rushed past them left 600 foot high chevrons in Australia, on the coast of Madagascar, up into India, to the Persian Gulf. This was a massive thing that you could imagine is sending up rain clouds that would have been unbelievable and slams down, creating an 18-mile wide crater, which I would imagine probably did some things to our crust and triggered lots of water. So this is from a magazine, from Discover magazine. I'm just going to read how it's describing the Burkle Crater. It says, the ensuing cataclysm sent a series of 600-foot-high tsunamis crashing against the world's coastlines and injected plumes of superheated water vapor and aerosol particulates into the atmosphere. Within hours, the infusion of heat and moisture blasted its way into the jet streams and then spawned super hurricanes that pummeled the other side of the planet. For about a week, material ejected into the atmosphere plunged the world into darkness. All told, up to 80, now they're speculating, up to 80% of the world's population may have perished, making it the single most lethal event in history. If you go and you look at the history of genetics for Y chromosomes, for men particularly, which is fascinating, about 6,000 years ago, it just tanks. And the genetic pool shrinks rapidly. We don't know why. Maybe this, maybe a flood. Something catastrophic happened to all of humanity. Here's another guy. This guy is very famous. His name's Robert Ballard. He's kind of like the underwater Indiana Jones. But he found the Titanic, he found the Bismarck, he found the USS Yorktown. And so 2 guys from Columbia University come to him and they're like, we have this theory. We think that something happened right about, in the thousands of years before Christ, where there was massive flooding all over the world, and we believe that it transformed the Black Sea, which we believe used to be freshwater, and transformed it into salt water, which would have had to have been a massively catastrophic event of massive flooding, right? And so this guy, he's got, Hercules. I still always want to sing, Hercules, Hercules. And he goes and he starts combing the floor of the Black Sea to find flood evidence. So if you know the story of Noah, he comes to rest on Mount Ararat, which isn't down in Israel. It's right on the coast of where the Black Sea is in Armenia and Turkey, right at the border. And so in the Black Sea, he goes down in 1999 and he goes 550 feet below the modern day surface of the Black Sea and he finds houses. Say what? So here you can see a Wadden-Dobble structure where you can see the little notch where they would hook it together, and there's the corner of the house, and this side it goes that way. So then he's driving along, he goes back in 2000, and he starts finding at 311 feet below sea level, before existing water, he finds architectural remnants of the wattle and daub structure that he had, pieces of ceramic, and stone tools. So a hammer and an axe, which you can see the axe head and the little place where the handle would be, and the hammer. So there's a civilization out in the middle of the Black Sea that's now covered in water. What in the world caused that? Well, I have an idea. You ever heard of polystrate fossils? This is just something curious. Polystrate fossils come from the name mini strata. So a strata is every long period of time, stuff settles, and then, a different kind of rock goes above that. And over, they would claim over millions of years, these strata form, and they encapsulate, fossils and everything else. But what a polystrate fossil does that really confuses them is look at all these layers. So let's pick one. So this one, you see a strata there and a strata there and a strata there and a strata there, but a tree is growing through all of them. And a tree is growing through multiple strata, and a tree is growing through multiple strata. Here's a big tree that goes through all these multiple strata. How do you make sense of that? So what they would say, what a person who's arguing from a place of polystrate fossils is, that tree lives, 30 years, 40 years. Every single one of those strata had to be laid in that period, unless it's just working its way and pushing through rock and layers of sediment and everything else, which is very unlikely that a tree would be growing underground. But it's saying something rapidly laid down these strata, and you find them all over the world. Interesting. Is it a flood that would just come in and lay down all those sedimentary layers over these fossils that did not exist and live for millions of years? One of the other arguments that I used to hear, and this got rejected just recently, is that even if we wanted to have a global flood, there's not enough water and all the clouds and all the lakes and all the seas and all the oceans to flood the earth as the Bible talks about. And you know what? That's true. That is true. But in 2014, a couple of guys went down and they were drilling, and they started finding this stuff called ringwoodite. And they figured out, because it used to be that we believed that all water on Earth came from these comets, these icy comets that smashed into Earth and left all their water behind. Well, these guys went down and they started finding there's massive reservoirs of water that's trapped in these little stones that are called ringwoodite. And they work as a hard sponge. Inside this stone, there's water. I mean, you can see it. That's what ringwoodite looks like right there. So you go down 400 miles beneath the Earth's surface, where we're standing right now, into the mantle layer, and there's so much ringwoodite in the mantle layer, so much water, and it works. I mean, the mechanics of it and the brilliance of it, it works like shocks. When the plates are moving all over it, it kind of absorbs it. The water helps to keep it from overheating. It's brilliant design. But there's enough water in all of that ringwoodite that you could duplicate all the water in the oceans. You could double the amount of water that's in our oceans. And so when the flood comes, what's the line that comes? All the springs of the great deep burst forth. It's not talking about the Florida aquifer. Right? It would have to be a lot more water than that. But guess what? In the mantle layer, there is that much water. Plenty of water there. And it pours down from above and covers the water. Or covers the earth. Just a thought. I mean, interesting stuff. And here you got a guy who's from the University of Miami. Cesare Emiliani, professor of geology at the University of Miami, discovered there was a massive infusion of fresh water. And all these dates are, he says 10,000 years, so you got to take that for what it's worth. But he says he goes into the Gulf of Mexico and he starts looking at all the foraminifera, is that right? Foraminifera, and underwater plants. And he starts looking at all these fossils that are ancient, and he notices that at one particular period, several thousand years before Jesus, all of these shells and fauna, underwater fauna, show radical changes in their isotope ratios. And so it means the salinity of the Gulf of Mexico, which, by the way, is connected to all other bodies of water. It's not a lake, right? It's connected to the Atlantic, which is connected to the Pacific. He notices that at this particular time period, the salinity of the water just falls off a cliff. It's overwhelmed with a deluge of fresh water. And he says, this was all through the waters of Gulf of Mexico, and this was his conclusion. It clearly shows that there was a major period of flooding from 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. There is no question that there was a flood, and there is also no question that this was a universal flood. So it's fascinating. And then in addition to that, some of the stuff that we're going to see as we get to the end of tonight, there are all these myths that are all over the world that cultures have taken with them that stack up and are very similar to the Bible. So John D. Morris, who used to be the president of the University of Oklahoma, he went out and he studied this, and he found more than 200 ancient myths that involve flood stories. And so he said, okay, what do they have in common? Let's tally them up. He found that God comes to a favored family to rescue them in 88% of the cases. They're forewarned of a tragedy in 2/3 of them. There's a judgment for wickedness in 2/3 of them. The judgment is flood only, so it's not like comets and rocks and fire and everything else. It's just a flood. They survive in a boat. There's animals involved. The animals are rescued. They survive by landing on a mountain. The location is given. Birds are sent out in more than 1/3 of them. The rainbow is mentioned in 7% of them. Survivors offer sacrifices to the gods, and 8 people survive in 1 out of 10 of them. And these are stunning details. Where do they get this? Why would they walk around? What is this seared-in memory of some event that makes them all write legends of a flood that decimated the world? Why? Where did that come from? All right, so one of the other things that's interesting is there's one of the things in anthropology that's really popular now is to say that all of humanity started in sub-Saharan Africa, and that they migrated from sub-Saharan Africa. The very first person, anthropologists would say, came from the deep south of Africa. And so here's a guy who did something pretty genius. His name's Johannes Krauss. He's a professor of paleogenetics at the University of Tübingen. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce that. So he went out and he went into all the different Egyptian mummies that he could be allowed to, some dating back all the way to 1400 BC. And he started taking DNA samples from their tissues, basically running like 23andMe or Ancestry.com kind of experiments to figure out where they came from. And what he found, because if you read the Bible, when you get to the end of the Noah story, there's something called the Table of Nations, and they leave Ararat, which is up in the region of Turkey or Anatolia. Remember, they're up there close to the Black Sea, and then they spread out. All the nations come from that point and spread out. And one of Noah's grandsons is a guy named Misraim, which he goes and settles Egypt. In fact, in Hebrew, Misraim means Egypt. And so he does all this stuff with Egypt, and he's saying, okay, if the anthropologists are right and the Egyptians came from sub-Saharan Africa, then their DNA should have more in common down there. But if the Bible's correct, guess where they're going to have shared genetics? And so they do all this, and this is what they find. He discovered that ancient Egyptian DNA shares most characteristics with Anatolia, which is Turkey, Black Sea, and the Levant, which is Syria and Israel, not sub-Saharan Africa. So this throws a real challenge to the premise that the anthropologists are right, that the first person came from sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot more credibility to what the Bible says, which is that civilization started up in that region of Turkey, Armenia, by the Black Sea along the Fertile Crescent. So that also throws a wrench into, and you look at migration patterns from DNA where they do all these things, where do they all intersect? You see it right there. And they just explode all over the earth. And so you see the Table of Nations in action. So Fertile Crescent, this is where Noah would have come down at Mount Ararat. This is where Abraham is from. Somewhere in this is Adam and Eve. So now we get to the story of the Tower of Babel. Love this. So if you go back to that region of the Fertile Crescent, so this is what we're looking at, and you follow the Tigris and Euphrates River, which are two of the rivers mentioned in Genesis as coming from the Garden of Eden. You go to that region, and there's tons of ancient cities that were established there. And you know what you find in all of these ancient cities where you see these red squares? These are places where they built towers. Towers were really, really revered in this region. And when we think of tower, what are you thinking of? You're thinking of like Rapunzel lowering her hair down, or you're thinking of the Eiffel Tower. No. The tower in the ancient world was a ziggurat, a stepped pyramid that looked like this. They didn't have technology or steel beams to go straight up, so they had to do this, right? And so those were the towers. And you find these ziggurats in all these cities, including cities that are named in the Bible in Genesis 10, cities like Babylon and Erech and Calneh and Nineveh and Calah. We find these ziggurats all over the place in this region, these towers. Okay, well, that's great. We're about to talk about the Tower of Babel. So these are pictures of some of the ziggurats that you can see that used to be temples. And what would happen at these temples is the god would build a high ziggurat that would go up, and it was said that the top little room of the ziggurat, that's where God lived. And so the king would go up the stairs, and he would go up to the very top room, and he would talk with God, and he would come down and tell you what to do, because God said so, right? It's pretty convenient. I'd like to try that someday. But anyway, like all of these ziggurats are all over the place in that region. This is the ziggurat of Warka from that region, 3000 BC. So this would have been around 1,000 years before Abraham. Here's another one. This one is actually where Abraham was born, at Ur. And this is when they were excavating it at the beginning of the 20th century. And what they find in all these ziggurats is how they built them. You know, when the Bible says, they said to each other, this is the story of the Tower of Babel being built. What do they say? Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And they used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar, which was new at that. Like you put tar in between the bricks to hold them together. And you go to all of these ancient ziggurats, and you know what you find between all the bricks? Tar for mortar. And all of them. It's just like it says. That's the ziggurat of Ur. That's what it looks like today after they've reconstructed it. And that's what they think it would have looked like. And above that wall, it would have started doing this, and it would have been absolutely massive in the city of Ur. So, okay, we pause. Because now we're living in a time, it's not like before Noah and at the time of Noah, we don't have any written records that predate Noah. Everything got wiped out. If we believe the Bible, everything got kind of stomped and brought down to one man and his family. But now after the flood, you come across and you start having all these written records, and they're pretty fascinating. So this is 4 stone tablets that are called the Enuma Elish, and they're about the Babylonian creation myth. So if you don't know this, when you read in the Bible, the word Babylon in Hebrew, it just says Babel. It's the same exact name. Babel is Babylon. They're interchangeable. And so this is the creation myth that dates back to 1900 BC, and it's going to tell you what the people of Babel believed about creation. So they believed that their chief god Marduk. So you know when Mordecai and Esther are in Persia, you know how Mordecai got his name? He was named after this. They worshipped Marduk, and so Mardukai. That's where his name comes from, because they worshipped this other god. He would not have liked that name, by the way. The chief god Marduk announced that man was to be created as a slave. So this is the idea. The gods are all unhappy. They're all warring. And Marduk comes along, get this, imagine this being your god, and says, I've got a solution, gods. This is going to be great. We can stop working. I'm going to make mankind, and they can slave away doing our job so we can put our feet up. Right? And so all the other gods see, and by the way, this would have been convenient for the king of Babylon. The god says you're to be slaves. And so what happens in Babylon, the gods didn't want relationship, they wanted servants. And so they so celebrate Marduk, this is their writing, their creation myth, that they elevate him. And to celebrate Marduk for creating a race of slaves, this is what they do. Upon hearing the offer, Marduk replied, you want to know how you can celebrate me? Create Babylon, whose construction you requested. Let its mud bricks be molded, and build high the shrine. According to the myth, the gods spent a year baking bricks, and then they built a high what? Ziggurat. So you get down to another king that comes along, the one who destroys Jerusalem. His name is Nebuchadnezzar. He reigned around 600 BC. He leaves records of all this that taking great pride. So he is the king of Babylon. He takes great pride at restoring this stepped tower whose construction had been abandoned more than 1,000 years earlier. So Nebuchadnezzar rebuilds this tower. The one who destroyed Jerusalem and led the Israelites out into exile rebuilds the Tower of Babel. Don't miss that. There's some poetry in that, by the way. And so if you look at this stone tablet, you can see this is what it would look like. There's Nebuchadnezzar, and he's celebrating, and he is rebuilding this massive tower with a temple to their gods at the top. And he is rebuilding something that was around at Hammurabi's time. Hammurabi is one of the oldest legal codes that we have. And if you look at the Code of Hammurabi, all the legal code is written on this black slate. And at the top of it, you have Hammurabi, the king, talking to God. This is the tower. And he is at the top of the tower, receiving instructions at the top of this great tower on what to tell the people. This dates to 1750 BC. And the tower is there in those days. And what does he say in the Code of Hammurabi? He opens it. I have in Babylon the city where Anu, their gods, Anu and Bel raise high their head, and Esagil, which is what they called the temple, which literally means the temple that raises its head, the temple that's higher than anything that's known on earth. Because remember, God doesn't destroy. He does not destroy the Tower of Babel. Never says that. So he's at this temple, and it says, whose foundations stand firm as heaven and earth that interlocks them, and he speaks on behalf of the gods. He bespeaks justice in the land from the top of this ziggurat, this temple. And so listen to this. These are Assyrian myths that are also talking about this incredible structure that's in Babylon, ancient Babel. And so this comes from Old Assyrian, and it's the god Anu pronouncing judgment upon the workers of a building in Babylon. He's really upset. So heaven is declaring judgment on a tower in Babylon. Does this sound familiar? And this is what the tablets that have been discovered say. What do you do with this? It says, of Babylon, he hastens to the submission. So this is their god, and they're pretending, that he has destroyed something. He's done something. Well, what did he do? Small and great, he confounded on the mound. What does it mean to confound? Literally what this is saying is God confused them on the high place. In his anger, also his secret counsel pours out to what? Confound their speeches. He set his face and he made strange their counsel. And so there's some event that they're remembering where the gods, heaven itself, confounded the people on the high place. He confounded their speech. Does that sound familiar? What are they remembering? Why are they writing this? When people read this or when they hear this, they're thinking, oh yeah, I remember when everybody's speech was confounded. Why would they write this otherwise? Here's a prayer tablet that goes back to this. It's called Emmerkar and the Lord of Arata. But listen to what they're begging the gods to do. Ready? Chant to him. The whole universe, chant to him. The well-guarded people, that they may address Enlil, one of the gods, together in a single language. It's like, oh, what we wouldn't give to have a single language again. Please, gods, have mercy on us. For the ambitious lords, princes, and kings, Enki, one of their gods, the Lord of abundance, shall change the speech in their mouths, as many as he had placed there. Wait a minute, gods have placed speech in their mouths? And so the speech of mankind, please God, do this, so that the speech of mankind is truly one. Why do you find, right at this time period, before Abraham comes along, all of a sudden about Babylon, there's all this writing about confounding of speech and begging the gods to give them unified speech again. How do you make sense of that? So you move on. Donald Wrench Jr., he's a professor of historical linguistics. Doesn't he look like a professor of historical linguistics? At the University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League. And he's writing, he says, it seems overwhelmingly likely to me that all human languages derive from one common source. Like there's telltale markers that everything exploded from one place. I think we would all be shocked if anyone ever came up with hard evidence that all human languages don't derive from one common source. And so what I want to show you, and this is part of where we're going to conclude tonight, is if you go and you look at the earliest 20 languages, this is just so wonderful. You look at the earliest documented languages, there they are. There's 20 of them. Egyptian, Sumerian, Canaanite, Akkadian, Eblite, Elamite. What's interesting about them is if you take the 20 earliest languages and you put them on a map, so the earth has a diameter, a circumference of 24,901 miles. Goes all the way around, 24,901 miles. Of the 20 earliest documented languages, 18 of them are right there. You could draw a 1,000-mile circle, right, on every side, 1,000 miles from Babylon, and 18 of the earliest languages fall in that. The two that don't are Mycenaean, which is up in Greek, and Old Chinese. Okay, well that's interesting. What's interesting about that is when you go and you study ancient Chinese culture, there are evangelists that are in China today that are trying to convert them back to their original faith. And the original faith of the Chinese, they worshiped a god called Shangdi. In the beginning, one God. And his name just means the high emperor, the Lord of heaven, the high and lifted up one is the idea. That's what Shangdi means. And so the first dynasty that ever comes out of China starts with a guy named Yu the Great, and he's writing in 2100 BC, right before Abraham's day. And you know what makes him great? When he arrives in China, the very first dynasty, the Shah dynasty that comes along, he finds the land and it's totally submerged in floodwaters. And so what does he do to create China? He goes to work making channels to get all of the floodwater that had inundated the land of China out to the sea so that they could begin cultivating the land. One of the oldest songs, and I want you to hear this, one of the oldest songs that you find in ancient China is a song to Shangdi. And this is what it says. Just get this. Of old, in the beginning. What's triggering in your mind, Bible people? In the beginning, God did what? Of old, in the beginning, there was the great chaos, without form and dark. Open up your Bibles. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. That sounds familiar. The 5 elements which they had for planets had not yet begun to revolve, nor the sun or moon to shine. So God is going to work creating before he even creates the sun, moon, or stars. Gee, that sounds familiar too. You, O spiritual sovereign, the first divided the grosser parts from the pure. He's talking about light and darkness. You made heaven. You made earth. You made man. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and he goes to work, and on the 6th day, he makes man. And all things with their reproductive power got their being. And you can go through this and hear the echo. Without form and void, darkness, he makes heaven and he makes earth. The first divided the grosser parts from the purer. He separates light from darkness. All things with their reproducing power got their being. What do you find all over Genesis chapter 1? It's like repetition. God said, let the living things come forward according to their kinds, according to their kinds, according to their kinds, according to their kinds, according to their kind. In other words, in association with what they reproduce. And you hear this Chinese song and you're like, what did they hear? Because they're writing this before Moses will write Genesis. In a land far away. Oh, and if you think that's cool, here is one of their ancient, this is a lady that initially, she was a Nua is her name. What's that sound like? Nua. Nua. There's a flood coming, right? Remember the flood that inundates all of China? And so the gods come down and they say, you're going to need a boat. And so they give a golden boat and she loads in. You can see all the people and her boyfriend's name or her male friend, I'm afraid to say out loud. We'll go with Fuxi. Fuxi, that's what it is. But he brings in all the people and you can see all the animals and they're in this golden boat. And there's this massive storm going, and it's raining, and it's flooding the earth. And so the gods give Noah a plan. They give 5 stones, a black one, a white one, a red one, a yellow one, and a blue one, the primary colors. So all the colors of the rainbow can come out of those 5, right? And they say, we want you to melt down these stones in this cauldron, and out of this cauldron, you're going to go up, and you're going to go to the great opening of heaven that is causing it to leak and flood the earth, and you're going to go up, and you're going to do patchwork. And so Noah goes and patches the sky with a rainbow. Where did they get this? What do they remember? Why is it that all these cultures all over the world have this common memory? Like, wrestle with that. If you got an alternative explanation, I'm all ears. But then beyond this, and this is just cool stuff. When they get there, Old Chinese, we said, is one of the 2 languages that's outside of that 1,000-mile radius from the town of Babel, right? Let's look at some Old Chinese, because Chinese, they write their words in compound form. So they take one symbol that means this word, and they add to it to make a fuller word. So for example, alive, dust, and man. You take those 3 symbols and you put them together, and that means first. Okay, alive, dust, and man. Where in the world, why would you put those words together? Maybe Genesis 2, where God scoops up dust from the ground and breathes into the first living man. And you just keep going. The word forbidden comes from 2 trees plus command. Does that ring any bells? 2 trees in the middle of the garden. One's the tree of life. One is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God gives a command. You shall not eat of it, or in that day you will surely die. That is forbidden. Or this, just amazing, right? The word for happiness or blessing comes from God, one, man, and garden. What memory do they have of God and man and a garden that is the land of blessing? Flood. This is an interesting one. The word flood comes from 8, united, earth, and water. Why 8? Well, let's see. On the ark, there's Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. How many is that? 8 united on earth and water is flood. Where do they get that from? Interesting. 2 trees plus a woman. I didn't write it. No emails, right? 2 trees plus a woman is to covet. Moving right along, no comment. Get this, the word naked, a man plus fruit. What happens? They take from the fruit, they eat, and they realize they are naked. These Chinese sure do come up with weird language, right? Strange combinations. A piece of the 2 trees is equal to pain. When does pain come into the world? It's when they violate the command of the 2 trees. This one's just weird. The word spirit, get this. You remember at the beginning? What's going on in the beginning of Genesis? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. Darkness is over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit is what? Hovering over the face of the deep. Spirit is one, hovering or covering, water, 3 persons, worker of magic. Well, what are 3 persons? And here's taking a theology class. How do you define the Trinity? God in 3 persons. It's fascinating. Thorns. Whoa, I didn't do that on purpose. Is that you, Mark? He's telling me to hurry up. You're running out of time. All right, thorns are weeds of punishment. To create is to move or walk, and to speak, living dust man. Say what? Righteousness. Now get this. From the beginning, how do you get righteousness? Sheep or lamb, hand, knife. Notice it's not righteousness checklist, like do a whole bunch of stuff. How do you get righteousness? A lamb must be slain. From the beginning. Guard. So I think angel at the Garden of Eden is a man and entrance tree all thrown together, guarding. And then we have the beginning is two people. And then we have execute. So what does God say? If you eat from this tree, you will surely be put to death. So to execute or put to death is words, tree, life, and dust. So when you're thinking Genesis 3, what happens when they disobey the command and they eat? God pronounces that what they did with the tree has taken their life, and now they return to the dust. Genesis 3. And so you look at all this, and all of this has an echo. And as we go through this course, what time do we have right now? All right. I wasn't as bad as I could have been. As we go through this course, like where archaeology is more prevalent, when we get into the new evidence about Sodom and Gomorrah, when we get into the evidence of the patriarchs, especially the life of Joseph, you are going to be absolutely blown away and encouraged that all of these stories, the Tower of Babel, like the more they discover, the more it's like, yeah, that was in that region. And oh my goodness, they're talking about languages. And look at this, the flood and all the evidence that's coming out. Like there's more and more reason, not just to believe that we have a designer and a creator God. We can reason ourselves to that, I think. But we have a God who is personally involved in us. All these stories, Noah, the stories of Abraham, God has been faithful to his people through all of these years. And you're going to discover as we go through this course that what you find in the earth, Jesus says, if the people won't praise me, the rocks will cry out. The rocks are crying out today. As they dig under all these civilizations and old cities and old places, as the rocks are coming forward, it's like God going, I told you. I'm real. I'm true. You can lean on me. There's overwhelming evidence that my word is true. And you can bank on not just the reality of the scriptures. More importantly, you can bank on the hope that's offered in the scriptures in Christ. That's the greater treasure. It's not just academics. It's not just saying, man, I see a lot of echoes tonight. The goal is this drives you to the one that all these scriptures are pointing to, the one who will crush the head of the snake, the one who became the ark for us, so that all who come in him will be spared the judgment. Like, that's the gospel, and it's offered freely from a God who loves you beyond measure. And so let me pray, and then you can leave. I'll take questions if you have them. But Father, Lord, I thank you so much for your kindness, for your goodness, for the way that you love us. Lord, for the way you can just see in these ancient Chinese words, Lord, that your covenant faithfulness shining through even that. I thank you for all this evidence, and Lord, I pray that it would encourage us and spur us to want to know you more and to love you more. And as we get into even more impressive evidence in the weeks to come, Lord, that you would use it as more than just an academic exercise, but that you would spur us to want to yield to the God who is real and true, who loves us more than we can possibly imagine. Regardless of our circumstances or our performance, Lord, your love is a gift that's offered freely. And we thank you for it. And everybody said, amen. All right, any questions? Yes, DJ.
There's a little piece of this between the 18 languages and all over here, and all this way over here, the old Chinese. There's like